All right, it looks like it might be tapering off. Again, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Sabrina Trask. I'm the Cumulative Impacts and Regulatory Affairs Manager here at ECMC. I want to welcome everybody to this stakeholder meeting and thank you in advance for attending. Today's presentation will be about an hour long. We're going to do an overview of ECMC's draft rules for cumulative impacts and enhanced systems and practices. The draft rules were noticed June 14th of this year. We do have an hour, and so because I've got a lot of material to get through, I won't be taking questions today in this meeting, but I would absolutely welcome your questions, comments, thoughts via email, and I'll provide my email address at the end of the slides today. The slides that we'll walk through today will give a little bit of a background on the evolution of this rulemaking. It's been a long, interesting journey. We'll walk through the draft rules, and then we'll give a little bit of information about next steps. I'd also like to sort of preemptively give you an apology. I'm the only speaker today, so you'll be stuck with me for the next hour or so. And I will confess that the slides today are a little bit visually uninteresting. There's not a whole lot I can do to spruce up, draft rules. So the content, I guarantee, is interesting and substantive and good, but visually it's not much to look at. One last thing before I jump into the slides, I'd like to take a moment to express my appreciation and gratitude to our ex-ECMC Commissioner, Karen McGowan. Her work over the past 4 years, particularly with cumulative impacts and with our environmental justice and DI community stakeholders, has really been inspirational to myself and many others. We will miss her a lot, but we look forward to all of the great things she's going to do in her new role with the City of Denver. And subsequently, I would like to welcome incoming Commissioner Tricia Oath, who was appointed by the governor yesterday to serve as ECMC's new public health seat on the commission. Tricia's experience as CDPHE's Director of Environmental Health and Protection will provide ECMC with new tools and new expertise to help us ensure the protection of public health, safety, and welfare and the environment. We look forward to working with Commissioner Oath on this rulemaking and other commission matters. So next slide, please. Let's jump in. Part of the brief background, this is legislative mandates parts 1 and 2 that most of you are probably very familiar with. This rulemaking is a continuation of ECMC's long-term efforts to understand and implement improvements to its cumulative impacts analysis process. Starting in 2019 with the passing of Senate Bill 19-181, ECMC promulgated the mission change rules, which established a new permitting process that took a more detailed look at incremental and cumulative impacts associated with oil and gas operations. This resulted in the creation of the Form 2B at CITER and the annual cumulative impacts report that was first published in January 2022. In 2023, House Bill 1294 was signed, which directed ECMC to conduct additional rulemaking by April 28, 2024, to further incorporate cumulative impacts process into its rules, and also to define the term cumulative impacts. That rulemaking, as you probably already know, was informally initiated in January of 2023, formally opened in January 2024, with the noticing of draft rules on February 8th of this year. Next slide, please. So legislative mandates part 3. House Bill 24-1346 and Senate Bill 24-229 were signed by the governor in May of this year, giving ECMC a slight redirection, or really an enhancement, in which to continue our cumulative impacts rulemaking. House Bill 1346 changed the rulemaking deadline to September 30th of this year and provided us with new statutory definitions and the requirement to conduct a cumulative impact analysis on all new oil and gas operations. I'll get to some of those details shortly. SB 229 provides ECMC the ability to hire 2 or more community liaisons and creates pathways for ECMC to collaborate further with the AQCC and the APCD in reducing NOx emissions through intensity targets and enhanced systems and practices in the non-attainment area, and particularly in DI communities. Next slide, please. So this slide recaps some of the work that the Commission has undertaken over the last year and a half to date regarding cumulative impacts. At least 12 different public input sessions were held over the course of 2023, as well as multiple ongoing opportunities for the public to submit written comments. Staff issued straw dog rules in January 2024 and noticed the revised draft rules in the hearing to meet the original April 28th, 2024 deadline set by HB 23-1294. As we all know, the Commission postponed and ultimately continued the cumulative impacts rulemaking in early April as the General Assembly considered legislation that resulted in House Bill 24-1346 and Senate Bill 24-229. Next slide, please. So staff noticed the newest draft rules a couple of weeks ago on June 14th of this year. The remainder of this presentation will walk through the newly noticed draft rules for cumulative impacts and enhanced systems and practices, which I will just refer to as ESP, Enhanced Systems and Practices, a bit of a mouthful for me. I do want to point out that these new draft rules are not under the same docket number as the previously issued draft rules. This rulemaking will now be conducted using docket number 240600145. This slide summarizes the draft rules, starting with some new and amended definitions, new rules 224, 225, 315, and 316, and amended rules in the 300 series, along with minor amendments in rules 604, 904, 803, and 1201. It's important to note that the amendments to Rule 803 and 1201 are for updated rule references only. The rules themselves have not been revised for content or intent. Next slide, please. So definitions, the big one, cumulative impacts. Our previous cumulative impacts rulemaking efforts focused primarily on air quality as the topic of greatest interest of the majority of our stakeholders. This rulemaking expands to include an evaluation of impacts to other resources as defined by statute, including water quality, climate, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources. Staff's proposed definition of cumulative impacts is taken directly from House Bill 24-1346. Next slide. Impacts to climate, that definition as well is taken from House Bill 1346 and basically is the quantification of emissions of greenhouse gas. I do think it's important to note that it also includes reasonably foreseeable truck traffic as well as reductions in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the proposed operation. So a little bit of a glimpse into possibly beneficial impacts as well as adverse impacts. For biological resources, we are using the definition developed by the Biological Resources Working Group from 2022. This was a working group put together through ECMC with a diversity of stakeholders. The definition that they came up with in 2022 is the report there is linked in this slides. And just to note, we will have these slides available on our website sometime later today. So you can access that report by clicking on the link in this slide. Next slide, please. Reasonably foreseeable future development is taken directly from House Bill 24-1346. Basically, that is development that has not yet started or occurred for which there is a valid local, state, or federal permit or a permit under consideration by a local, state, or federal entity. That also includes permits only if they are publicly available. So a permit that hasn't been submitted yet or is deemed confidential would not apply under this definition. One of the biggest definitions, or possibly most interesting definitions, is the definition of impact area. This definition we adapted from House Bill 1346. The language there is almost verbatim. We added pursuant to the act there in italics, because we wanted to focus that the impact area discussed here today are the impacts associated with oil and gas. This would not apply to geothermal operations or ultimately CCS or Class 6 operations. This is oil and gas only. And where the definition says that the commission will determine the impact area, we intend that that impact area would actually be determined, initially determined by the director. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further into the rules. That would be part of the pre-application consultation that we'll get to shortly. Next slide, please. The definition of disproportionately impacted community is taken from Senate Bill 24-229. One of the new topics in this rulemaking that we didn't have earlier this year is enhanced systems and practices. This definition is adapted from Senate Bill 24-229. It's basically equipment, methods, or other operational techniques that are designed to avoid, minimize, and mitigate emissions of ozone precursors from oil and gas operations. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the slides. We had a proposed definition of industrial facility from our February 8th notice draft rules. We continue to use the same proposed definition for industrial facility. So that includes facilities related to industrial manufacturing operations. It does include oil and gas producers, energy producers, refineries, meatpacking plants, dairies, so on and so forth. It's basically any facility that is sort of heavy industry in nature that could be a potential source of adverse or beneficial impacts. Next slide, please. Some other definitions that I'm not going to list out or go through here are those that have been a hot topic of conversation for quite a while now, so nothing totally new. Community liaison, energy and carbon management operations and operator, greenhouse gas intensity target, NOx, NOx intensity target, and ozone non-attainment area. Next slide, please. So in our previously proposed rules, we proposed creating a new position called a community liaison. This draft rule has been expanded to include language adapted from Senate Bill 24-229. We intend to hire at least 2 community liaisons with the intent, again, for one to be sort of positioned on the West Slope and the other to be positioned here with expertise in the Front Range or DJ Basin. We intend, again, to hire both of these positions by the end of 2024, and that the hiring process will not impact the timing of the review of oil and gas development plan or OGDP applications. Next slide, please. So this is a big one that might feel a little bit out of the blue for some of you who have been involved in our previous cumulative impact rulemaking work. New Rule 225 introduces a new program for operators that has been informally described over the past year as the Race to the Top. This program, formally known as Operator Impact Reduction and Preferred Operator Designation, is in response to the governor's letter dated March 16th, 2023, which requires ECMC to develop a program of environmental best management practices that incentivize and reward operators who demonstrate industry-leading performance in greenhouse gas and local air pollution mitigation and reduction, with the overall goal of fostering a carbon-neutral oil and gas sector. The program is entirely voluntary. No operator would be penalized for not participating in this program. Although the program's origin is to support the reduction of ozone precursors and greenhouse gas emissions, the Commission recognizes that reduction of these pollutants is beneficial across the state and not just in the ozone non-attainment area. So the program would be administered for operators throughout the state. The basic tenets of the program are that an operator may voluntarily commit to using a suite of BMPs that are above and beyond those required by rule and represent the very best available technology. This commitment would apply to every OGDP application submitted by an operator for a calendar year. It will also include a statement confirming the operator's compliance with APCD's Reg 7 NOx and greenhouse gas intensity targets where applicable. If the director approves the operator's impact reduction program, the operator will receive expedited review of future OGDP applications, possible exemption from certain Rule 304C plan requirements, potential placement of OGDP applications on the Commission's consent agenda for hearing, and recognition on ECMC's website as a preferred operator, which could have some pretty great benefits to operators in marketing and investment campaigns. Should the Commission adopt this program, staff intends to publish a detailed guidance document with specific instructions for operators, including basin-specific lists and options for BMPs. Next slide, please. So the next couple dozen slides are just going to walk through the 300 series of rules. I've tried to highlight only those changes from these proposed rules to the current existing rules, but on occasion, I do highlight in my notes here differences between our previous draft of the cumulative impacts rules and the rules we're discussing today. So Rule 301G, pre-application consultation. This process has been happening for about a year and a half now, informally outside of rules. What this is when a local government, we'll just use Weld County because they're very involved in industry. When a local government has a local permit that is required for oil and gas, they would set up a pre-application consultation. Staff has been attending these consultations, particularly with Weld County and with Garfield County for a couple of years now. The process works really, really well. And so it just makes sense for staff to want to formalize this process in these rules. So the pre-app consultation will be required for every OGDP. Consultation notice is required for residential building units within 2,500 feet of the proposed location. And I want to just note that in the slides here, wherever you see RBUs, that stands for residential building units. And I'm going to try to not overwhelm you with so many acronyms. The consultation will now include, on top of what it has already been including, it will include the cumulative impact discussion, the determination of the impact area, and a discussion on the applicant's NOx, if applicable, and greenhouse gas intensity target status. Participants historically are the local government, relevant and proximate local government, the operator, of course, ECMC staff, CDPHE, CPW if a location is nearer within a high priority habitat, but the participants will now include residential building unit owners that are within 2,000 feet of the proposed location, and will also include a community liaison if the location is proposed within a DI community. Next slide, please. So Rule 303 is where the procedural requirements for oil and gas development plans, or OGDPs, has lived since mission change. I think the biggest change, and it may have been startling for some of you that opened up the draft rules and saw a lot of important information scratched out. The important takeaway here is that Rule 303A5, which describes CIDR, the Cumulative Impacts Data Evaluation Repository, and the Form 2B, the Cumulative Impacts Data Identification, has been moved. It has been moved to new Rule 315, so we'll walk through that a little bit later today. Rule 303A5 itself, the language has just been sort of minimized down to be nothing more than a simple placeholder requiring the Form 2B as a component of every OGDP application. Rule 303D, public comment period. Our current rules prescribe either a 30-day or a 45-day public comment period. We're proposing to expand public comment period to 60 days for those OGDPs proposing locations within a DI community or within 2,000 feet of a DI community. This will give our DI community members and environmental justice stakeholders and others additional time to understand what is being proposed near their community, and provides more time for them to engage, to participate, and to provide feedback. Rule 303E, the completeness notice, has been changed from notice requirement out to RBUs from 2,000 feet, now expands those notice requirements out for RBUs within 2,500 feet. Next slide, please. Rule 304 is a big one. It's all of the information requirements that belong on the Form 2A. A Form 2A is required as part of every OGDP application. And the Form 2A is the location assessment, oil and gas location assessment. It's a big form. It was dramatically expanded during mission change rule, but otherwise isn't being significantly changed in this proposed draft rule. One thing that has changed that could be significant for operators is that under previous or current rules, the alternative location analysis, or ALA, was only required if a proposed location met any one of the ALA criteria listed in Rule 304B2. Now we are proposing that every new or amended oil and gas location, so anytime a Form 2A is required, that ALA will also be required. Parts of the ALA contents, and I'll get to this a little bit later as well, appeared to be duplicative as to what we were developing in the new cumulative impact analysis. So pieces of the ALA requirements of content related have been moved to new Rule 315B. Again, we'll get to that shortly. And then Rule 304B to D is the new cumulative impacts analysis. And just because I guess we need another acronym, CIA, the cumulative impacts analysis is required for all OGDP applications. It will be required for all proposed new or amended locations. And it will be required for all alternative locations that are evaluated in the alternative location analysis. Again, details will be found in new Rule 315B. Next slide, please. The location drawing, this is an old attachment that's been around since 2008 or 2009, since when the Form 2A was first developed. The only revision we're making to that in these proposed rules is to add in industrial facilities onto that location drawing or location map. The disproportionately impacted community map, these new rules propose adding some requirements for locations within DI communities, including requiring the distance and the direction to all residential building units, high occupancy building units within 2,000 feet of the proposed location, and a table indicating the number of RBUs and HOBUs that are between 2,000 feet and out to 1 mile away from the proposed location. Rule 304C is the long list of plans that are required on the Form 2A. Those plans will be required to also address incremental and cumulative impacts generally. Next slide, please. 304C19, the Community Outreach Plan. It's an existing rule. One significant change that we're proposing is that it's required for locations within 2,000 feet of any RBU or HOBU, not just within 2,000 feet of RBUs that are within a DI community. We also clarified that the community outreach plan should include a description of impacts that are anticipated both during pre-production operations and production operations. So we generally think of pre-production operations as construction, drilling, and completion. That tends to be fairly short-term, but there's a lot of activity that could happen on a well pad or an oil and gas location over the next 20 to 30 years. So we want to be sure to include impacts that could be anticipated over the production phases. The community outreach plan should also include a description of the operator's long-term plan for continued outreach and engagement with RBUs that are within 2,000 feet. Again, kind of not just we've drilled, we've completed, we're done, but sort of that continuing and ongoing dialogue with local and nearby residents when there's a workover, when there's a recomplete, when there's other operations taking place there. Rule 304D, lesser impact area exemptions. This is an existing rule. What we're proposing to change here is to prohibit the director's ability to grant these exemptions when proposed locations are within 2,000 feet of RBUs, and to prohibit the director's ability to grant exemptions when the proposed locations are within a DI community. ALAs, alternative location analyses, and CIA's, cumulative impacts analyses, are not eligible for these exemptions. That information will always be required unless the operator wants to request a variance from it. Next slide, please. Amended Rule 306, this is the director's recommendation on the OGDP. The director's recommendation must include some sort of a statement describing whether the operator has exceeded or has not exceeded either its NOx intensity target or its, if applicable, or its greenhouse gas intensity target. There are a suite of possible conditions of approval that could be recommended in the director's recommendation based on the operator's most recent APCD Reg 7 annual or interim report on NOx or greenhouse gas intensity target status. We also recognize that there could be new to market operators and operators that are not subject to various targets based on production values. There will be potentially COAs recommended in the director's recommendation to cause the operator to acknowledge that they will be in future compliance, or they will provide continued exemption from those targets. A director's recommendation of denial would include a determination that the operator is projected to exceed its NOx or greenhouse gas intensity target. And then the notice of the director's recommendation will be required for anyone who participated in a post-completeness consultation. That's Rule 309. We'll get to that shortly. If that person provided an email address. We do sometimes get folks that attend various meetings and they don't give us an email address, so we don't have any mechanism to provide any extra information to them. So if you want to get extra information, make sure that at a consultation or a meeting, you make a point to give your email address. Next slide, please. Amended Rule 307, this is the Commission's consideration of OGDPs. Approval can only happen if the operator is not projected to exceed its NOx or its greenhouse gas intensity targets where those targets apply. And if the operator is projected to exceed its targets, then a denial is on the table. Next slide, please. Amended Rule 308, this is Form 2s, or applications for permit to drill, deepen, re-enter, APDs. The proposed new rules hopefully make a clear distinction between the processes for Form 2s that are subject to an OGDP and Form 2s that are not subject to an OGDP. Examples would be locations that were permitted or built prior to mission change rules or prior to 2021. Or locations where no cumulative impacts review was conducted. So for Form 2s that are not subject to an OGDP, it will require a cumulative impacts analysis and a Form 2B, that's the cumulative impacts data identification, or will require an OGDP. All Form 2s for pre-mission change locations will require an OGDP after November 30th of 2026. This, of course, is accepted for unplanned sidetracks where the work is currently being conducted. When a Form 2B or a cumulative impacts analysis is required for a Form 2, a Form 4 may also be required. This is standard practice. We've been doing this for a while now. A Form 4 could be submitted to the location ID to provide additional BMPs or updated information about the location. Part of the new rule proposed here, though, also does create a pathway for the commission to initiate proceedings directly to hear a Form 2 rather than having an administrative approval or denial by the director. Next slide, please. Amended Rule 309. Rule 309 has always just been called consultation, and it's been a little bit of a source of confusion because there's a lot of different opportunities and instances of consultation. Specifically, amended Rule 309 is to clarify this is consultation after the OGDP has passed completeness. So proposed new Rule 301G discusses the pre-application consultation. Amended Rule 309 discusses the post-completeness consultation. Specifically, the consultation with building unit owners and tenants. There will be a formal community meeting required for locations that are within 2,000 feet of RBUs or HOBUs that are in a DI community. This formal community meeting will be coordinated between the operator and our community liaison, who will help determine the need for childcare, transportation, interpretive services, meeting logistics, like where should the meeting be held, what time, what day, who needs to be invited. The operator will provide information to all participants that will include the contact information for the operator, the relevant local government, and the commission. The operator will also provide information about any enhanced systems and practices, which is new Rule 316. Again, the attendees, I would encourage attendees to provide their email address to receive additional notice and information related to a proposed operation. And the operator will provide the director a summary of that meeting within 10 business days. Next slide, please. Rule 309F, still in post-completeness consultation. This is specific to consultation with CDPHE. Consultation will be required for locations that are within 2,000 feet of an RBU, locations that are in a DI community, and any RBU is within the impact area, and for locations that are in the ozone non-attainment area where pre-production operations are proposed between May 1st and September 30th. The first two bullets there, the within 2,000 feet of an RBU and in the ozone non-attainment area, those are consultations that our CDPHE liaison, Tessa Sorensen, has already been conducting. So this is not new information. This is just sort of formalizing the information and requiring it officially in these draft rules. Next slide, please. Another hot topic from earlier this year, amended Rule 311. This is the expiration of OGDPs, Form 2As and Form 2s. So Rule 311A, for OGDPs that are submitted before December 1st, and there's a caveat there that I'll get to momentarily, no changes from the current rules. The OGDP, the Form 2A, the Form 2 are valid for 3 years. Rule 311B, for OGDPs submitted after December 1st, 2024, the OGDP, the Form 2A, and the Form 2 would be valid for 4 years. However, in those instances, no pre-production operations would be allowed after the Form 2A expires. No pre-production operations would be allowed after the Form 2 expires. The OGDP may include a request for a different expiration date if 4 years is unreasonable. The asterisk there on the December 1st, 2024 date, that's just basically a flag that says these are the dates and the distinctions between types of OGDPs submitted, or the timing of OGDPs submitted, based on the effective date of these proposed cumulative impacts rules. So depending on when these rules get adopted and then and what the rules look like, it would be when these rules go into effect is when that cutoff would be. That's roughly December 1st. Next slide, please. New or revised Rule 311C extensions. There would be no extensions for OGDPs or drilling and spacing units. There would be an option for extensions for Form 2As and Form 2s. They may be granted by the director for up to 12 months, but only if the drilling operations have commenced for at least one well on the location prior to the Form 2A expiring, and a Form 2B and a cumulative impacts assessment has already been submitted and reviewed as part of the approved OGDP application. Extensions may be requested. The operator can submit a Form 4 sundry notice. It has to be at least 3 months prior to the expiration of either the Form 2A or the Form 2. And the director will approve or deny the extension within 30 days of receiving all of the necessary information. So we know sometimes a form might be submitted and it's maybe missing an attachment. The director will have 30 days from receipt of all of the necessary information to make a determination of approval or denial of that extension. Next slide, please. Refile and amended forms. This is almost a little bit more sort of administrative than an actual rule. It's to clarify that refile forms are required to continue pre-production operations beyond the expiration date of the approved OGDP and beyond the date of the approved extension. So refile forms are identical to the previously approved form and generally match the information. They're requesting the same operations, and there's just a lot of duplicate information. Amended forms are those forms that are proposing a difference or a change from the previously approved 2A or Form 2. This will require new information. This becomes a little bit critical when staff is reviewing an amended form versus a refiled form, because if the information is significantly different, it means that new information is required, whereas a refile, some of the information is already existing in the location or the well scout card and may not be necessary to review because we've already reviewed it. The Rule 301G pre-application consultation should include a disclosure by the operator if they intend to permit a refile or an amended form as part of an OGDP application. Next slide, please. Amended Rule 312. This is existing subsequent operations on existing wells. We propose that subsequent operations to drill or complete an existing well are prohibited when the Form 2A or Form 2 for that well or location is expired. The operator should submit and obtain approval of an OGDP and an associated Form 2A, Form 2 to resume drilling and completion operations. When this occurs, this applies in cases where wells are drilled in 1 year and then uncompleted, and then 5 years later, an operator wants to come back and complete that well. It's been a long time, and there could have been a lot of changes that occurred on the ground at that location. So we want to have a look at cumulative impacts. Another example is when wells where surface casing has been set, but the well was never actually drilled to the final total depth, and it's been a long period of time now. The permit is expired, and the operator is ready now to come back in and finish drilling that well. Again, we would want to have a second look at the cumulative impacts, the substantive change in the landscape around that location. Subsequent well operations other than drilling or completions may be approved by the director via the current Form 4 process. There's no change to our existing rule with that. However, the director may require a Form 2B and or a cumulative impacts assessment with that Form 4. Next slide, please. The next handful of slides are all specific to changes in Rule 314, which is comprehensive area plans. I'm going to go through these really quickly. They're basically all changes that have been addressed for OGDPs and are just sort of the duplicate changes in comprehensive area plans or CAPs. One thing I do want to note, though, is under Rule 314B, under rights conveyed, there's been a lot of discussion since mission change, really, about the Form 2B not being required for OGDPs that are part of an approved CAP. This rule proposes that right basically is eliminated, and I don't like to say it like that, but the only way to get cumulative impact, Form 2B data, cumulative impact data into our database or into CIDR is through the Form 2B. And so until we come up with a mechanism to get CAP cumulative impact data into CIDR, the only way we have to get that data into CIDR is through the Form 2B. So for now, unless somebody wants to propose something new and miraculous, which would be amazing, we would request or require that a Form 2B will still be required as part of the OGDP submitted as part of an approved CAP. The pre-application consultation, as it is required for an OGDP, would also be required for a CAP. And for some of the CAP maps, we are asking operators to provide existing utility lines, including electrical transmission lines and substations. Largely, applicants have been giving us that. This is just sort of codifying it into our rules. Next slide, please. Timing of operations. If a CAP is proposing pre-production operations in the non-attainment area between May 1st and September 30th, that needs to be highlighted in the application. There's some expansion of review of locations proposed related to water resources and biological and soil resources as well. Next slide, please. Disproportionately impacted communities. The CAP application should require or would require a narrative describing not just current status, but past, present, and reasonably foreseeable adverse impacts that are within or within 2,000 feet of a DI community for locations that are within or within 2,000 feet of a DI community based on the operations proposed at the location, the access road, the flow, any flow lines, any pipelines or utility corridors the operator intends for the OGDP or for the CAP. Also requires a description of how the operator intends to avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts. A new piece in Rule 314 is the requirement for the operator to indicate their NOx intensity target status for those CAPs that are within the ozone non-attainment area. You'll see this again in the next few slides down the road here. So one thing I want to note, there's language in Rule 314E10H that basically is describing that subsidiary operators, so operators that are a subsidiary to a larger parent corporation, they will demonstrate their NOx intensity target based on the overall parent company's target. That is something that staff took directly from APCD's Reg 7 language. That way we are consistent with our partners at APCD in identifying and understanding and discussing NOx intensity targets. It would require a statement of NOx intensity target status that is based on the most recent Reg 7, APCD Reg 7 report. There's going to be 2 reports. Operators will report twice a year, and APCD staff will then sort of provide a follow-up summary report twice a year. The annual report is, I think it's due at the end of June every year, and that is for emissions reporting to APCD for the previous calendar year. And then the interim report is due by operators submitted to APCD in November, and it indicates their emissions, or at least their NOx emissions, in the non-attainment area from May 1st to September 30th. So depending on the timing of their CAP application, whichever of those 2 reports is the most recently submitted report is the data that we would review in their CAP application. For operators that are not subject to a target, specifically those operators that are low producing and they're not a majority operator, they're not a minority operator, a statement of compliance with Reg 7 and with the ESPs that we'll talk about here shortly. Next slide, please. Same with greenhouse gas intensity targets. Every CAP application will demonstrate their greenhouse gas intensity target status. Again, based on their parent company, not the subsidiary company. They'll provide the statement of their status based on the most recent Reg 7 annual report. For new to market operators that don't yet have a Reg 7 annual report, they'll provide a statement indicating that this status is required, and they will provide it when it is available. Rule 314F1, the public review process. This is going to require completeness determination notice of completeness to all RBUs within 2,000 feet of proposed CAP locations, and requires notice of completeness to all RBUs in a DI community that are within 1 mile of proposed CAP locations. So expanding the awareness, the notification, and the ability to provide feedback to folks in DI communities. Next slide, please. Public comments. This is a little bit more of a clarification. The director will consider all public comments received on a CAP application within 60 days from the date the CAP is posted on the ECMC's website after completeness. We have seen a trend in the public wanting to provide comments outside the standard 60-day public comment timeframe. And the commission feels very strongly about making sure that those comments are submitted and are reviewed. This rule is to clarify, though, that the director cannot continue to respond to or consider public comments ongoing. We have to set a limit to it so that the director can write the director's recommendation, and we can push the CAP application directly to the commission for hearing. That said, the commission has every opportunity to consider any comments received outside the public comment period, including those that are received through e-filings or other means up to the morning of the hearing, essentially. Rule 314F3, a public meeting for a CAP application. Again, similar to previously stated with OGDPs, the community liaison will provide input to the operator on meeting logistics, the necessity of childcare, transportation, and interpretive services. The community liaison will be involved in those types of input and decision based on their expertise with the communities that they serve. The operator will provide their contact information and the commission's contact information. Again, attendees are encouraged to provide their email addresses so that they can receive additional notice or information. And the operator will provide the director a summary of the public meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, we're down to about 10 minutes, so this is the big stuff. I'm going to try to be as clear as possible. New Rule 315, Cumulative Impacts and Data Analysis. Think of New Rule 315 as having two parts. 315A is the existing Cumulative Impacts Data Evaluation Repository, or CIDR, and the Form 2B. That information was moved from Rule 303A5 to New Rule 315A. So I'm not really going to go over it too much. It's the ongoing process that we've had since mission change rulemaking. So 315B is the new part. It's the new cumulative impacts analysis. Just a quick refresher about the Form 2B. The Form 2B captures the impacts of the proposed operations in the proposed OGDP. It does not capture the incremental or cumulative impacts of alternative locations or sources of impacts from other sources outside of the OGDP. The only way to populate data into CIDR is through the Form 2B, as I mentioned earlier, regarding CAP applications. And then CIDR is used for the commission to summarize and understand long-term cumulative impacts via our annual report. So that's what the Form 2B does and does not do. The cumulative impacts analysis, the 315B section, is where the data is collected about alternative locations and sources of impacts other than those sources in the proposed OGDP. Next slide, please. So the Form 2B, if these rules are adopted, the Form 2B will need to be updated. We would add impacts to climate as mandated by HB 241346. Those would be included in the Form 2B's air resources section. Biological resources is a new section. It would be included in the Form 2B soil resources. Other surface and industrial impacts would be included in a new section in the Form 2B. Under the current section in the Form 2B for beneficial impacts, the way it's set up right now, operators can say, we plan to plug 10 wells, which is wonderful, and that is absolutely a tremendous beneficial impact. What we have discovered over the last few years of OGDPs is that there's no simple way for the commission to track the plugging activity of those wells. So by adding a new section or enhancing the beneficial impact section with new data fields on the Form 2B, we would capture the API number of the wells to be plugged and the location ID number of the locations to be closed and reclaimed. This will help the commission understand and more effectively track the plugging and abandonment of wells and any reclamation and closure work. It can also help us create pathways in our database, both in CIDR and the COGIS, the regular database, to link to the Form 6, 6A, and 6B for well plugging. This also provides potential efficiencies in revised financial assurance plans. And then the other addition to the Form 2B would be a new addition of the NOx and greenhouse gas intensity target status. Next slide, please. So Rule 315B, the cumulative impacts analysis would be required for every proposed new or amended location in an OGDP. Would also be required for each alternative location evaluated in the ALA as part of a Form 2A in an OGDP. Would be required for Form 2s that are not subject to an OGDP, would be required for extensions of Form 2As or 2s, and may be required for subsequent well operations or proposed operations for which a Form 2B or a cumulative impacts assessment has never been conducted. Next slide, please. This is a big topic, the impact area. We're proposing that the impact area for the cumulative impacts analysis is a 1 mile radius from the proposed location's working pad surface. The impact area may be expanded larger than 1 mile due to the nature, intensity, and scope of operations, the potential impacts, the geography, whatever other receptors or sources might be near that 1 mile radius. There would be part of the discussion in the 301G pre-application consultation. The rule describes that this would be determined by discussion between the operator, the director, and local government. We certainly would require or seek additional input from other participants in that consultation, whether it's CPHE, CPW, the State Land Board, the BLM, local residents within 2,000 feet, just depending on the unique circumstances of each OGDP or of each location proposed. The commission then would defer to the director's determination of that impact area. If an egregious error was identified through the process, the commission could overturn the director's determination. But our intent is that pre-application consultation is thorough and thoughtful and robust, and we are able to reach consensus between all the stakeholders in that meeting about what the impact area should be. Next slide, please. The contents of the cumulative impacts analysis are very similar to those found in an ALA. So essentially high-resolution aerial images showing all kinds of different potential sources of impacts and potential receptors. Next slide, please. Narrative descriptions of past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future development will be required as part of the CI analysis. A list of measures that the operator intends to use to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse cumulative impacts. And as directed by statute, a narrative evaluation of the incremental and cumulative impacts on these specific resources: air quality, water quality, climate, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources. Next slide, please. The commission and the director in her review will consider the operator's cumulative impacts analysis, looking at how well the operator intends to avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse impacts, understanding which adverse impacts cannot be mitigated, what are the beneficial impacts, what type of engagement has the operator had or will the operator have with nearby residents, certainly public comments and the operator's response to those public comments. If there are any locations that would more appropriately or more readily avoid adverse impacts, the relevant local government's disposition on the permit or their own local permit, consultation results, and the operator's record of compliance with the Act and Commission rules. Next slide, please. New Rule 316. This is specific to oil and gas operations in the ozone non-attainment area. This does not apply to other parts of the state. That's a really important clarification. This is only in the ozone non-attainment area. So there's 4 parts to this new rule. And I'm going to apologize now because I realize it's almost 4 o'clock and I still have about a dozen slides to go. So I understand if folks need to bail. Those of you that can stay on, I appreciate your patience. 4 parts to new rule 316. 316A is the permitting process and review process for OGDPs that are proposing pre-production operations between May 1st and September 30th. 316B is the permitting process and review process for when an operator is requesting approval to conduct pre-production operations between May 1st and September 30th for operations that have already been permitted but have not yet been undertaken. 316C is the new Enhanced Systems and Practices, or ESPs, and 316D are actions to reduce NOx emissions. 316A and B are revised from staff's previous February 14th, 2024, not 224, draft rule, 904D through I, slightly modified, but if you were involved, for those of you that were familiar with our previous draft rule 904D through 904I, then 316A and B will look very, very familiar to you. 316C and D are new additions to these rules, resulting specifically from the 2024 legislative session, and particularly Senate Bill 24-229. Next slide, please. So I'm going to maybe kind of skip some of this because we went over this with the previous draft rules in our stakeholder meeting. I think that was February 14th. Basically, again, if you're a subsidiary operator, you have to demonstrate your NOx intensity target based on your parent company's target. Your Form 2B in your OGDP application will include a statement of your NOx intensity target status. And OGDPs that are seeking approval for pre-production operations to be conducted between May 1st and September 30th of the upcoming ozone season must be submitted by December 31st. That is not a guarantee that the OGDP will get to the commission for hearing anytime before ozone season, but if you try to submit an OGDP, April 1st for operations in May 1st, that's probably not going to happen. So that's just a timeline there. Next slide, please. So a new form, again, this was initially rolled out in our previous draft rules, new Form 2D, emissions intensity assessment for operators that have operations approved through an OGDP, whether that's a Form 2A or Form 2, and they want to act on those approved forms and conduct pre-production operations between May 1st and September 30th, they'll need to submit a new Form 2D. This will be effective beginning in 2025. Because the first NOx intensity data won't be available until the end of 2024. So by February 15th, starting in 2025 and then each year thereafter, any operator that wants to conduct pre-approved pre-production operations between May 1st and September 30th for the upcoming ozone season will submit the Form 2D and demonstrate their NOx intensity target, again, based on the parent company's target. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's just more about the Form 2D. The director may approve the Form 2D to authorize those pre-production operations in the ozone season, but only if the operator demonstrates that in the previous ozone season it did not exceed its target, and that its proposed operations will not cause it to exceed its target in the upcoming ozone season. If the operator exceeded its NOx target in the previous year, or the proposed operations will cause the operator to exceed their NOx intensity target in the upcoming season, the director will deny the Form 2D. If the director does deny the Form 2D, the operator has a right for a hearing before the commission at the next available hearing opportunity. Next slide, please. If an operator has an approved Form 2D, but then determines that they have a change of plans, they can submit a new Form 2D. If it's required, they would also need to submit a Form 4 under Rule 301C, changes to an approved OGDP. This sort of replacement Form 2D would be reviewed just like the first Form 2D, and can only be approved if the requested change results in no net gain of NOx emissions, or a clear indication that, again, the operator will not exceed its NOx target. The director will report to the commission each year, no later than April 15th, a summary of the pre-production operations that have been authorized for the upcoming ozone season. Next slide. 316C is new, Enhanced Systems and Practices, or ESPs, for the operations in the ozone non-attainment area. This is directly from Senate Bill 24-229, requiring ESPs to avoid, minimize, and mitigate emissions of ozone precursors from operations at newly permitted oil and gas locations in the non-attainment area. So this is not retroactive to existing locations. This is just new permits going forward as of the effective date of these rules. These rules attempt to adopt an initial list of ESPs as recommended by CDPHE. In the event that CDPHE is able to provide any photochemical sensitivity modeling analyses, that will be part of the review here as well. Currently, that doesn't exist. And then the bill requires that we periodically update the list of ESPs. In particular, these should be administered to minimize adverse impacts to DI communities. Next slide, please. So I might skip some of the details here. Basically, if you drill down into Rule 316, there's a handful of different, I guess, categories of ESPs. There are ESPs that are required for oil and gas locations in the non-attainment area year-round at all of those locations. There will be ESPs required year-round only in DI communities. There will be ESPs required between May 1st and September 30th at all locations, again, in the non-attainment area. And ESPs required between May 1 and September 30th only in DI communities. And then there's another subset of ESPs that will be encouraged to be used between May 1st and September 30th outside of DI communities. For these sort of encouraged or if feasible ESPs, any of those that an operator is unable to commit to, they will need to provide a discussion as to why the ESP is not available, or how implementing it would cause adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources. Next slide, please. And the last of the new rules, 316D, actions to reduce NOx emissions. Again, this is taken directly from Senate Bill 24-229. It requires operators to take actions between May 1 and September 30th in the non-attainment area to reduce emissions of NOx generated from production and pre-production operations in order to assure compliance with NOx intensity targets and other NOx rules that the AQCC will adopt by rule to achieve sector-wide compliance. So the mandate, again, for us is to prioritize actions for those operators that do not demonstrate compliance with NOx intensity targets. Next slide. What this looks like is an assessment of an operator's compliance with their NOx intensity target based on the previous year's pre-production and production operations in the non-attainment area between May 1 and September 30th, as reported in their Reg 7 annual or interim report or the Form 2D. Target exceedances result in actions that may include the requirement of additional ESPs or shutting in wells or plugging and abandoning wells. Next slide, please. And then similarly, if sector-wide industry as a whole is not hitting their NOx intensity target, the director can require additional actions, which may include a prohibition of operations during the ozone season, requirement of additional ESPs, shutting in wells, or other actions that the director deems necessary. Next slide, please. I'm almost done, I promise. Rule 604, out of the 300 series and into 604, siting requirements for proposed oil and gas locations near RBUs. The new rule proposes to remove DI communities from the substantial equivalence process. And new rule 604C requires any new or amended locations, Form 2As, with a proposed working pad surface that's within 2,000 feet of any RBU or HOBU that is in a DI community to obtain informed consent from all RBU owners and tenants, or locate all the wells, tanks, separators, and compressors more than 2,000 feet from all the RBUs, even if the working pad surface is less than 2,000 feet. Next slide, please. Rule 4, evaluating cumulative impacts. This is existing Rule 904. Simply one rule was referenced for the, one rule reference was updated for the CITR, moving the CITR rule from 303A5 to 315A. And then the cumulative impacts report will also include information about NOx and greenhouse gas intensity targets. Next slide. Rule 803 and Rule 1201 each had a single rule of reference updated. Again, it was related to the Form 2B or the ALA. Some moved from 303A5 or 304 into new Rule 315. Next slide, please. And this should be the next steps. So we're done with the technical part. The deadline for party sign up for the cumulative impacts rulemaking is this Thursday, June 27th at 2:00 p.m. Those of you who wish to be parties to this rulemaking should use the e-filing system, which is linked there. If you can't get to this link, it's on our homepage under hearings, under e-filing system. Pre-hearing statements and other subsequent filings will be set, I think, by the end of this week. An order will be issued by one of our hearing officers, so just keep an eye on either in e-filings if you've submitted a party request, or watch ECMC's homepage under news and notices for updates on those additional engagement dates. The hearing for cumulative impacts and ESPs is scheduled to commence September 13th. We anticipate it will be a very detailed and exuberant hearing that may take up to 10 or so days. So we've got our calendars blocked off from September 13th through September 30th. Our statutory deadline to adopt rules is September 30th, so there's not a whole lot of wiggle room with that. Next slide. So I want to thank all of you. I apologize for going over a little bit. Thank all of you for your attendance here today, and certainly for your ongoing engagement and participation, your insight, your ideas, your questions. It's all part of the process, and I, for one, am super pleased that we have such diverse and passionate stakeholders. It makes my job fun. It also makes the rules better and the processes better. So thank you again for your participation in this rulemaking. If you have any questions about the draft rules that we've posted or about the rulemaking process, please feel free to email me directly. My email address is sabrina.trask, state.co.us. And then just as a side note, we do have other upcoming rulemaking efforts coming soon. Our deep geothermal rulemaking hearing is set for early August 2024. Carbon capture and storage, or Class 6, is scheduled for late October this year. And produced water rulemaking is tentatively set for December of this year. So those are more options to be involved in ECMC's policy and regulation matters and hearings. Thank you again so much. I appreciate your attention and your patience. Reach out to me at any point. And I see from Jana Jacobs, notice has hearing starting on September 3rd, 2024. Thank you for that confirmation. So with that, I'm finished. We will post this slide deck onto our website, and I look forward to the ongoing collaboration with our wonderful stakeholders to make this a successful rulemaking. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.